Welcome to the Lean Solutions Podcast, where we discuss business solutions to help listeners develop and implement action plans for true lean process improvement. I am your host, Patrick Adams. Hello and welcome to the Lean Solutions Podcast. My guest today is Mark Graban, and Mark is a returning guest. He was with us back in season 1 when we talked about his book, Measures of Success. Today, we're going to be diving into his newest book that released in June, The Mistakes That Make Us: Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation. He's also the author of the award-winning book, Lean Hospitals: Improving Quality, Patient Safety, and Employee Engagement. He serves as a consultant through his company, Constancy, Inc. He's also a senior advisor for the technology company, KaiNexus. Mark is the host of a couple different podcasts, actually, Lean Blog Interviews, and then My Favorite Mistake. So welcome to the show, Mark.
Patrick, hey, it's great to be back. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'm super excited to talk about your book that just released recently, The Mistakes That Make Us. And I'm interested to hear like the inspiration behind this, because obviously you've been running your blog and a couple other podcasts, which you and I've have interviewed each other both ways. But you recently started a podcast, My Favorite Mistake, not too long ago. And I'm just kind of curious the connection there, or what was the inspiration for the book?
Yeah, I mean, I started the My Favorite Mistake podcast right about the time you started your podcast, September 2020. Right. Pandemic, work from home kind of project. But some of the roots of it go back a little bit further to a book that I published and contributed to called Practicing Lean. It was about 2015 or so. Like some mutual friends of ours, Paul Akers, Jamie Flinchbaugh, Jamie Parker, 15 other authors, all wrote a chapter kind of around this theme of looking back to mistakes we had made in our first year or two of lean practice. Sharing those stories as a reminder. I mean, like mainly, I'm like, pointing the finger at me as a reminder of like, hey, when other people are new to a practice like this, they're going to make mistakes out of enthusiasm or not having a great coach by their side. Like, don't be too hard on people when they're learning. And there's, we hoped with the book people could learn from some of the mistakes we made. That was one level. But then the other level was this reminder of, what, we're all human. We're doing our best. Mistakes are going to happen. So don't be too hard on others. And again, a reminder to myself, don't be too hard on myself. So that project had been out there, and as and people listening in lean land, we get focused on things like mistake proofing and trying to prevent errors in different ways and not blaming individuals for systemic mistakes. And so then started the podcast September 2020. I'd been doing the Lean podcast since 2006, and occasionally would get pitched different guests, like, oh, someone's got a new book out and do you want to have them on your podcast? And I would say no if it wasn't at least kind of adjacent to lean. One of those people, Kevin Harrington, who had been one of the sharks on season 1 of Shark Tank, like they were pitching him. And I thought, I would really love to find a way to say yes. I could have shoehorned him into the Lean podcast, but with some brainstorming back and forth with the PR people, like, what do you think about a podcast about learning from mistakes? They thought it was a great idea. Kevin Harrington thought it was a great idea. He was the guest with his co-author, another entrepreneur, Mark Tim, on episode 1 of My Favorite Mistake. And then, fast forwarding to March of 2022, after about 100 plus episodes under my belt, and started seeing like there's some patterns here, right? I think I'm doing some pattern recognition. There are definitely lessons learned, not just stories from the podcast guests, but the lessons about learning from mistakes as individuals. And then how do we create a culture in our workplaces where we can focus on learning from mistakes as part of that cycle then of trying to prevent the recurrence of that mistake and preventing other mistakes. It sort of started down the path of being a book project and kind of took a meandering path, as a lot of things tend to do, of the initial book concept to what got published. But I'm really happy with the results, and I hope readers are going to agree. I hope it's interesting reading, and I hope, maybe more importantly, that it's helpful to people. Some ideas about how can we build or strengthen a culture of learning from mistakes.
Powerful. And just hearing you talk through that, I was thinking to myself about, just myself, and like, am I worried about making mistakes, and where does that come from? And so I was thinking through that a bit. You've been around the world, you've talked to people all over the world. Is it like a US culture thing, or is it something like, are all cultures that way? Why are we so afraid to make mistakes? Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, where does that come from?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I've got some of my own reflections on what others have taught me. I think there are some human tendencies. I don't know if I'm fully qualified. I can't point to research that says, okay, how universal is this? How much of it is Western culture versus other parts of the world and business cultures? But I mean, I think on a couple levels, like making a mistake stings, right? I mean, one of my guests who's a psychologist taught me a little bit, and don't ask me to name the part of the brain, but there is a part of the brain that is our mistake detector, our mistake making detector. And there's got to be kind of a helpful evolutionary trait there of realizing when we've made a mistake. Like if we made a decision that we thought was a good decision at the time, we take action that we thought was the right action at the time, and then at some point we learn, okay, no, not really. Not so much. We could be completely wrong. We could have been a little bit off track. We could call that a mistake. It's probably helpful to recognize it. But then I think the question is, what do we do next? Do we beat ourselves up? Do we dwell on the mistake? Like, that's probably not super helpful. Like, I think, to me, and I've seen from others, when you can get past the sting, and there's people who have taught me that a mistake that we make in front of others, that adds an embarrassment factor, right? So making a mistake that no one else knows about, like, okay, that might sting, but maybe, hopefully that's easier to get past compared to the embarrassment factor. But then when we make a mistake that's apparent to others, I think the reaction of those other people matters greatly, right? Can I be kind to myself and get past the mistake? Are others reacting kindly to my mistake, whether they're my boss or my client or colleagues or whatever that relationship is? I think being able to focus on moving forward, acknowledging the mistake, acknowledging if there was a bad outcome, not dismissing that, but then saying, well, what did we learn? What was there a bad assumption? What could we do differently in that situation or a similar situation? Or how can we try to learn in a way that mistake proofs a repeat? I think being able to have that forward focus can take us down a more positive path instead of looking back or saying like, like language. A lot of my guests will use language of like labeling, oh, that was a stupid mistake. I'm like, I understand, like I do that sometimes, but I don't think that's like, I think that kind of language isn't helpful. I think it's good to say, I made a mistake. That was the mistake. Like point out the fact of it and try to avoid language like dumb mistake, stupid mistake, whether that's directed toward ourselves or others. So I think some of those things might be some human nature to get out of my own head about it and how I react to mistakes. I think there are definitely some patterns, and maybe we can talk about this. Good research and understanding about what we can do in a workplace to make it more psychologically safe. There are some things there that point to some pretty universal human tendencies.
Sure. Now, and I think you're spot on with that. And it's super interesting to me because I obviously work with a lot of organizations where they have that fear-based culture where people are just so worried about, they made a mistake and they don't want to bring it to light, or they don't want to be transparent about it because of some kind of backlash that they might get about that.
It's not even fear. It's probably been demonstrated to them. Like,
right. Absolutely.
Unfounded fear, and unfortunately in workplaces, right?
Yes. And that does bring up a question, so obviously, The question that I just had was about me personally, or a person who makes a mistake and they're feeling. But where do you think it comes from for leaders that are creating those types of environments? I mean, is that something they've been taught? Is that something that they just feel like will give them the right outcome if they create an environment where people are scared about making mistakes? Like, where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is maybe reinforced through workplace cultures. People following, people young in their career or at lower levels following the lead of their more senior leaders. Workplaces, I think of, starting my career at General Motors plant in 1995, it was a very punitive culture. A lot of that sadly exists in healthcare today in the year 2023. But I think it's sort of ingrained in workplaces. I think there's a funny disconnect I don't totally understand yet of, I think individuals will more quickly agree with a statement like, we're all human, we all make mistakes. I mean, people will say, okay, sure, it's human error, we make mistakes, we're imperfect. But then somehow at an organizational level, there's often this unfair expectation to be perfect, to not make mistakes. And so there's one train of thought where it could be people think, well, mistakes are bad. To get less of something that's bad, we punish or threaten punishment. And people will learn not to make mistakes. The problem, though, is what people learn is covering up and hiding their mistakes. They get better at doing that.
That's right.
I don't think the fear is preventing mistakes. And there's a assumption that probably goes back to like McGregor theory X thinking of like, do you think people are trying to screw up? Like, people sometimes use this phrase, that was an unintended mistake. I'm like, that's redundant. Right? I mean, if somebody did it intentionally, that's sabotage, that's different, that's something you would punish, right? But if someone makes a mistake, the punitive reaction on so many levels is counterproductive. Like, someone made a mistake and you fire them, and if that mistake most likely had some sort of systemic cause and you put a new person in that same system, it's a matter of time before they're going to make that same mistake.
Right.
So it's counterproductive to say we're going to fire the mistake makers. Like, well, could we develop a test and identify the mistake prone, the most mistake prone, and fire them proactively? Like, none of that really, seems to work. So I think the punitive reaction drives mistakes underground. I think we hear from a lot of different lean people this idea, we cannot solve a problem that we don't see, that we're not aware of. But then, I got some interesting feedback from some people on LinkedIn when I kind of posed this question of like, why do people think the punitive approach works? And I thought this was really eye-opening. I can't credit any one person in particular. They're like, they're not being punitive because they think it works. They're being punitive because it deflects responsibility. We can shift the blame to somebody else. Like, okay, that's maybe good for some individuals, but not good for the organization. There's some misalignment there.
Well, for sure.
Yeah.
And obviously you touched on lean a little bit. I'm curious to hear a little bit more around, how learning from mistakes fits into a lean culture. Is it something that should be highlighted as an important piece of developing a lean culture? Is it something that isn't necessary for developing a lean culture? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely necessary, and we can point to Toyota and we the team at KaiNexus. There are a lot of stories in the book, more than I thought would have been the case when I started writing.
Yeah.
So the book is not 100% based on podcast guests.
Sure.
Maybe come back to KaiNexus, but Toyota, I think there's this pathway where learning from mistakes is one trigger for continuous improvement. Not all continuous improvement is reaction to a mistake, but that's a lot of it. Even with the long history and practice of poke-yoke, mistake-proofing practices at Toyota, they still have final inspection at the end of their assembly lines because guess what? They do not yet have a perfectly mistake-proofed built-in quality process yet. And maybe they never will. I don't know. But you look at this great collection of stories about Toyota and how leaders react to mistakes. So one of them, the book, I see on your shelf there are our friend Katie Anderson, who you went to Japan with, Asao Yoshino, who you met and got to spend time with in Japan. And I've gotten to do the same with him a long while ago. But, as Katie, helped document in the book, and then Katie and Mr. Yoshino came on My Favorite Mistake and told that story. And Katie was supportive of me kind of retelling a shorter version. People should go read her book and get more from it. But there's that story. And then the parallel. So Yoshino, Japan, 1960s. My friend David Meyer, who was also on the podcast, who started at Toyota in Kentucky in the 80s, have amazingly similar stories of wrong chemical going into the paint machine, Japan, Yoshino, wrong chemical going into a bumper part molding machine, Meyer and the team in Kentucky. In both cases, management reacted so consistently, like this cannot be coincidence, this is culture. Leadership saying, we, meaning the organization, failed you, the workers and the team. We're not blaming you for the mistake. We need to understand what happened and focused on learning from it and preventing that from happening again. And I've heard stories in my travels. I don't think I'm necessarily authorized to share here or in the book, but like when I tell these stories, people come up and like, you know what? I did an internship at Toyota when I was in college, and here was my story. Like they have a similar story of a mistake where that reaction. I'm not saying Toyota's perfect. Somewhere in the big wide world of Toyota today, some leader might have gotten upset about a mistake.
Sure.
Right. But there's this cultural intention of creating a culture of learning from mistakes. And we can create that in other organizations. And like going and looking at some of the Toyota Way literature, the book Toyota Culture by Jeff Liker and Mike Hoseas. And Hoseas was a Toyota employee and leader. As they said in the book Toyota Culture, this is my mistake. I don't have the exact quote handy because I'm doing a presentation next week. But they talk about the importance of making it psychologically safe for people to be able to admit mistakes, to speak up, to pull the and-on cord. So here's the quote from the book. I found it. Mistakes are okay as long as people learn from them. Right. So that's pretty directly coming from Toyota. A quote that I put in the book from Akio Toyoda of the family, who had been until recently CEO and has now become chairman, saying it's in our DNA at Toyota. Mistakes once made aren't repeated. So that's there for people to to pull in some of those direct words from the book from Akio Toyoda. And then I think you can see evidence of the psychological safety that they also emphasize in the book, Toyota Culture. The safety that's there for people to speak up or pull the and-on cord. That's a big part of the culture. A mistake isn't the only reason you pull the and-on cord, but that's certainly one of them, right? So there's a lot, I think, of evidence that points to this being an important part of Toyota's culture, as we've heard from different people in different ways. And the good news is we can work to build that culture, at places like KaiNexus, if that's something that you want to explore, being a younger software company as opposed to an older, global automaker.
Hey everyone, this is Patrick. So sorry to interrupt this episode of the Lean Solutions Podcast, but I felt it necessary to take a quick moment and personally invite you to the Lean Solutions Summit on October 2nd through the 4th this fall, 2023. The theme of this year's global summit is leadership, people, purpose, passion. You do not want to miss this amazing experience with the top process improvement experts from your industry. No matter what industry you're working in, this summit has value for you. The summit offers 4 different industry tracks to include healthcare, corporate, higher education and nonprofit, and finally, government. Our opening keynote is Chris McChesney, the lead author of the #1 Wall Street Journal best-selling business book, The 4 Disciplines of Execution. The Ops sisters, Kathy Miller and Shannon Carrolls, the authors of Steel Toes and Stilettos, will be joining us, as well as yours truly and over 20 other speakers. The final day of the summit is full of workshops, and there are limited seats for a tour of Menlo Innovations with Richard Sheridan and Zingerman's Mail Order with Dr. Jeff Leiker, author of The Toyota Way. Early bird pricing is now available at FindLeanSolutions/Summit-2023, or you can check the show notes for a link. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, and that's really my next question is so you talked a lot about Toyota, and actually before I even go to that question, one question that did come into mind after hearing Mr. Yoshino tell his story and reading it in Katie's book, and obviously, and then hearing you, I'm just thinking about how that made Mr. Yoshino feel. And because you've been mentioning psychological safety, and I want to get into that as well. But that's a big part of the how you create a safe culture where people are learning from their mistakes, right? I mean, the ripples of that, where someone doesn't get reprimanded, they're not getting yelled at, they're being thanked, and they're being told, thank you for bringing this to our attention.
Right.
Let's work through this together and figure out how do we make sure it doesn't happen again. That the ripples of that, for Mr. Yoshino are much different than they would have been otherwise.
Well, because he remembers that story, really vividly, and then when he became a leader at different levels, he was going to pay that back to others. And you asked, how did that make him feel? I remember, pretty direct quote from the podcast. He said it made him feel proud,
yes,
to be part of Toyota, that they could have blamed me and they did not. And that might be surprising or eye-opening to people, whether it's there or Georgetown, Kentucky, or I hope there are similar stories from when Toyota opened their plant in San Antonio.
Right.
Or anywhere around the world. They want that to be a consistent culture, and it's taught and it's reinforced and emphasized in different ways. It seems coming, from the CEO on down, and that's the case at KaiNexus. That leadership comes from one of the co-founders, not just from him, but it starts really with Greg Jacobson as a CEO and co-founder. He came on My Favorite Mistake and is willing to set that example of sharing and admitting stories about mistakes, and then creating a culture where, a similar way, non-punitive reaction to mistakes, and being able to learn. And I think that's an important part of Toyota or KaiNexus's continued growth, even though they're on so many levels such a different kind of company than Toyota. It really comes back to people and leadership. I know I'm preaching to the choir here. This is not about lean tools. This is not about copy the andon cord. I mean, we know what happens if you copy the andon cord and have the tool and the method without having the mindset. Someone pulls the cord, they get yelled at for stopping the line. Forget fancy words like psychological safety. They learn not to do that again.
That's right.
And instead of being rewarded for it. So I think there's the flip side to the thinking, the incorrect thinking of, well, mistakes are bad, I will punish mistakes, we will have fewer mistakes. There's, I think, a flip side of it that says, well, if I don't punish, that's giving permission to make more. And again, that's grounded in Theory X thinking of saying, well, people don't care about having pride in their work. Well, I would say no, they do.
They do.
People don't want to make mistakes, especially mistakes that impact a customer or have an impact on the company. And if people don't care about the connection, that's a whole different cultural problem. That's
sure.
probably beyond the scope of anything I could fix. If people don't feel that sense of connection between, personal achievement and company success, that's a deeper thing to sort through.
Absolutely. And Mark, you gave us an example here in the US of KaiNexus, because my question was around, obviously we know Toyota is doing this and doing it well, has been. Is it possible for other companies to do this? Can we create a culture where people feel safe to learn from their mistakes? And clearly, you gave us an example. What would you say? Expand on what you talked about with KaiNexus, and what does it take for leaders to create this safe environment where people can begin learning from their mistakes?
Yeah. So we can create that culture, and there's a fairly clear pathway. It's not like flipping a light switch, like any culture change. It's like building trust. It takes pretty sustained effort. It can take some time to build. It can be wiped out, unfortunately, more quickly, than it's built. But it's just a real quick thing of a couple other CEOs who've been on the podcast, founders, and really building this culture. 1-800-Flowers. Like anybody who's ordered flowers or gifts or from them, their founder, he's now chairman, Jim McCann, is very passionate about creating a culture where it's okay to admit mistakes and figure out how to learn from them. Michigan, another mutual friend of ours, within your state of Michigan, my original home state of Michigan, Rich Sheridan from Menlo Innovations. He was a guest on the podcast recently, talking about that same idea within a different software and technology company there in Ann Arbor. So I think, at KaiNexus, as Greg and I reflected, and there's more of some of his thinking in the book that we didn't explore back in the podcast, of he would say from the beginning, going back, let's say 2011, when he and Matt, the other co-founder, and then I was involved a little bit there, like there was intention around building. And I see Katie's book behind you, so every time I say the word intention, I think of Katie.
Yeah.
It's not that, that's only her word, but I'm seeing the book and she says that a lot, and maybe some of that's rubbed off on me, and that's fine. But so hi, Katie. But there was intention in creating a culture of continuous improvement within KaiNexus, of everybody participating in improvement. It's okay to speak up about opportunities for improvement, because KaiNexus is serving customers through a technology platform. We're serving customers that are building a culture of continuous improvement. So some of it is, it's just we think the best way to run a business. We want to go experience what our customers are experiencing, and there's alignment there. Now, what Greg would say is that there wasn't the same explicit intent around building a culture of learning from mistakes. That was a little bit more emergent. When you start having stories I've been involved in as the mistake maker, or someone in the position to react to a mistake, hearing other people's stories, that there was a real pattern. But I think in a way it's a natural offshoot of things like respect for people, systems thinking, understanding mistake proofing, and that, Greg, in his exposure as an ER doctor, has been exposed to the modern healthcare quality thinking of the old Deming idea that most problems are really caused by systemic factors. So we need to focus on improving processes and systems instead of getting rid of the quote unquote bad apples, right? So then once you kind of identify, okay, yeah, there is a pretty consistent culture of learning from mistakes. I feel confident enough putting KaiNexus out there this way in the book. I'm not saying they're the same as Toyota, but there are similarities where I think we're all confident that it's not going to end up being embarrassing of like, oh, that's not really a reflection of reality anymore. I really do think it is, and the KaiNexus team would agree. But then back to psychological safety, is I've had a chance to start more formally studying this a year ago through Tim Clark, author of a great book called The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. Taking some training and getting certified through him and his company. They have a psychological safety assessment, 12-question survey with some free-form responses. And my sense was that psychological safety was pretty high at KaiNexus. Mm-hmm. But so I proposed to Greg and the leadership team. I'm not proposing this because I think there's a problem. I think it's a good to great opportunity. Can we do this assessment? And they agreed. And KaiNexus went through and we had everyone do the survey, and the company scored in basically the 80th percentile. So I'm like, okay, that's good. It's good, right? Yeah. And they really then leaned in to figure out, how do we identify barriers to people feeling safer, psychologically safer, and then trying to identify what can we do to try to strengthen the sense of psychological safety. I love Tim Clark's framework. He started off in manufacturing, also, by the way, even as more of a social scientist. The 2 main countermeasures or actions that help build or strengthen psychological safety are leaders A, modeling what he calls vulnerable acts, things like admitting a mistake, saying I was wrong, et cetera, and then rewarding others when they follow the lead. So modeling and rewarding vulnerable acts, that's something KaiNexus, I think, generally does really well, but then realizing there are opportunities to try to reinforce that culture, be more intentional as more people join the company, make sure that this is part of kind of the cultural norm that's explained, and saying, well, okay, we have a culture of emphasizing the learning instead of being punitive. And again, like when people make mistakes, when they care about the company and the mission, they feel bad. There's nothing to be gained from getting upset and yelling at somebody. They feel bad, help them work through feeling bad, so then they can, get into a place now where they're able to collaborate around root cause analysis, understanding the system, and being involved in the improvement phase. Yeah.
Mark, do you feel that creating this type of culture is this completely left up to the leaders? And what happens if the leaders leave that are doing this right, and someone else comes in that maybe, I mean, how do you develop a system around this? Yeah. How do you make sure that you're creating a culture that's committed to this for long term?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's parallels to questions around lean culture, right? There's that risk factor of what happens if, the lean zealot CEO leaves. Then there's that moment of truth of like, who does the board or whoever's deciding who's the replacement? Is it a promotion from within, somebody else who's just as committed to that, whether it's lean or psychological safety or all of that together? If you bring in an outsider who's like, no, that's not me. I've been successful at other places. We don't need this woo-woo psychological safety nonsense. I'm going to go back to, cracking skulls when people make mistakes. You're going to drive away people who don't have to tolerate that. And framing it in a more positive way, higher levels of psychological safety will help attract and retain talent.
Oh, absolutely.
There are many, many studies. This is not just a feeling, but studies from Amy Edmondson and others about the direct connection between higher levels of psychological safety and business success. So like, to me, this is like lean or continuous improvement or respect for people. You could make a values judgment around, well, that's the right way to do things. That's the right way to treat people. But you could also argue and say, look, it's good business. So there's risk of, bringing in the outsider, or maybe you promote someone who is just giving it lip service, and then their true colors show. I mean, like, there are these moments of truth of how are leaders reacting to things. Now, culture is not only driven by the CEO. When you do surveys, and Amy Edmondson saw this in some research around Google, you see variation in different teams in different parts of the company, because like there's there's an effect from the CEO cascaded on down, but then local leaders, that's really, I mean, maybe a bigger influence of how does that plant manager react to mistakes compared to a plant manager someplace else. So there's local impact, and that's how, you know, they were able to identify that variable of psychological safety as being so important at Google when they were trying to answer the question of why are some teams and some businesses more successful than others. If psychological safety were evenly layered across the organization, that, I mean, you know, they wouldn't have discovered it as a factor because it wasn't a factor, but they learned that it was. And so, you know, you see the impact of leaders, and back to your question, that risk of it could fall apart, as we've seen with, you know, a lot of the lean case studies. What happened to Wiremold when they got acquired by a company that didn't share the same viewpoint on lean leadership? There is that risk. So it comes back to questions of, you know, the board and succession planning, and really making sure where that commitment is to keep that style of leadership going.
Absolutely. Great points, for sure. So Mark, obviously we could talk forever, and I'd love to hear more stories, you know, that you've put in the book, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet, so I'm going to hold off on that. I want to read the book myself. And if anybody's listening in that is also interested to hear more of these amazing stories and just some of the insights that you have in the book, you know, and help start creating cultures of their own to learn from mistakes, where's the best place to go to get a copy of the book?
So people can go mistakesbook.com. They can go on Amazon. It'll be available through other retailers, but most immediately right away on launch through Amazon in paperback, hardcover, and Kindle versions. Audiobook to come probably fall of 2023 here. Congratulations on the release of your audiobook, the
Appreciate that.
Use Appearance Trap.
Yes.
So I'm going to follow in your footsteps there. It'll be my first audiobook.
All right. Good deal. No, that's great. What we'll do is we'll drop a link into the show notes for everyone. So if you're interested to grab Mark's newest book, you can go into the show notes and find a link directly to the website there. Otherwise, Mark, you're out on LinkedIn, I know, very active on social media. So you can definitely find him there as well. Mark, it's been great to have you on. I always love touching base with you and catching up. Everything that you do for the lean community, appreciate you, and obviously looking forward to this book and the impact that it's going to have on so many organizations, knowing and understanding that, you know, if we can just start learning from our mistakes instead of feeling like we have to hide them, I mean, what an amazing culture that can create for so many organizations. So thank you so much for that. Appreciate that.
Thank you. I get excited about these things. I hope I didn't make the mistake of rattling on too long about any of it.
Not at all. Not at all. No, I thought it was great. So thanks again, and appreciate it. We'll have you back on maybe towards the end of the year sometime. We can talk about how the book's doing, and maybe even dive into, you know, maybe one specific concept from the book. And yeah.
Maybe I've never put anyone on the spot with this question, but maybe I can ask about your favorite mistake, whether you come do that on my podcast or we can do it here on your home court.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I have lots of mistakes that I've made over the years. To point out one would be to think through that, Mark.
Well, you got to give someone time to think through this.
Yeah, well, I have lots for sure.
We all do.
Lots of learning too. You know, like you, I understand the value of learning from mistakes and understanding that it's part of the process of growing and developing yourself as a leader. So definitely let's do that. Let's jump on your podcast. I'll bring a one really, really good mistake that I've learned from over the years, and we'll talk about it.
Okay, that'd be great.
All right, Mark, have a good week.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Lean Solutions Podcast. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to subscribe. This way you'll get updates as new episodes become available. If you feel so inclined, please give us a review. Thank you so much.